Hi guys, this is John Edward Willie, and today I'm going to read a journal entry that I wrote this morning. But as a sort of preface, this is a part of a couple other larger projects, one of which is what I call life notes. And life notes is when I wake up and I walk and I record my thoughts on my phone, and then I come home and sort of listen to those thoughts, listen to the recording, and I type a journal entry while listening to those thoughts. And it's a way of like really grounding myself in my day before my day begins by overhearing myself speaking on the one level, that is sort of hearing myself saying what I'm facing that day or what I need to overcome that day or what I'm thinking about or how I can better explain the very choices that I'm going to make. But also there's a secondary act, which is that when you sit down and actually write by hand, which is how I first write these life notes when listening to the recording, it's with a pen or a pencil in hand. And then I also type out usually about 1,000 words while listening to that recording. And sometimes it's about practical problems, but often these recordings are about very philosophical subjects like the question of consciousness or questions regarding history or stupid stuff like that. But sometimes I'm recording poems. You know, I might wake up and just sort of walk and speak poetically and then use that recording as a really wonderful way of sort of beginning the writing process, because that's often very difficult when one writes. And so this is ultimately leading to another project of mine, which is called Draw Water. And what that is a book or a series of books that I hope to publish, which would be my journal entries, culled and edited and polished for publication. But ultimately, Draw Water and the Life Notes Project, which creates these typed little journal entries, it's a part of a sort of mosaic that I guess I'm creating, which allows me to not explain what I think systematically, which is often a false way of explaining what one thinks, but instead capturing portraits or sort of vignettes of my mind in motion. That is, this is sort of a portrait, a self-portrait of a mind in perpetual motion. And so that's sort of how I see these. It's sort of like a train is moving by and you see windows, and in each window you see a different scene. And that's how I see each of these journal entries. But this particular journal entry is about journal writing itself, and it's sort of meta, I guess, because it's a journal writing entry about journal writing itself. But it's in regards to what I call life notes and the unique construction, as well as some of the particular characteristics of my journal writing and kind of a genealogy behind my approach to this torturously beautiful craft called writing. So this is May 18th, 2026. I write to discover what I think. It is a simple premise, but executing it feels like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. I cannot write with a rigid plan, at least not when it comes to this specific kind of journal writing. These life notes are not meant to be a polished blueprint or a tidy ledger of daily events. Instead, they are designed to perform a dual function, to warm up my hands and mind like a musician running scales in a cold room, and to compose a running, living record of my mind. This practice is far more stream of consciousness than any other kind of writing that I do. I intentionally drop my guard and allow myself to write whatever flashes across my mind without filter, apology, or hesitation. This discipline of writing without overthinking, of sitting down to compose roughly 1,000 words of raw, unadulterated thought, is precisely the ritual that I have maintained for 10 years, or more, 12 years. It is a wild and frankly a little sobering to realize that I have been doing this for more than a decade and still haven't published anything from it. I have a profound sense of how effective this habit has been in terms of developing my voice and learning to love the solitary work of writing as I go. Yet I am acutely aware of its limitations. Raw expression can easily devolve into self-indulgence, and so I constantly work to acknowledge and integrate these limitations into an evolving form. Let us be honest. It is incredibly hard to write. I realize the weight of that truth every time I sit down and try to force the internal monologue into an external text. Hence, this specific approach. As I push through the initial resistance and just keep writing, the sentences slowly begin to take on a new kind of form. They loosen up. They become easier to construct. Thoughts flow across the page with greater liquidity the more I commit them to paper. That momentum alone is reason enough to continue. But my ultimate intention is to compose thoughts this way to make a chaotic interior world more valuable and accessible to myself. And yet, the immediate mirror of the page is rarely flattering. I am often deeply embarrassed to see how ugly, clumsy, and inefficient my words are when they first land. Do I really speak or think in this terribly disorganized, inarticulate way in my own head or aloud? In those moments, the typing feels like a profound waste of time, a foolish misuse of those precious, quiet morning hours when I could be doing 100 other practical things. But deep down, I know this isn't a waste. I know I haven't written anything fresh in almost 4 days, and the consequence of that dry spell is painfully visible right now. It shows up as a sort of mental rust, the pathetic syntax, this faulty grammar, this dislocated punctuation, and this distorted verbiage. When I step away from the page, the gears seize up. Conversely, if I commit to fresh stream of consciousness writing each day, the translation from thought to text becomes a significantly smoother thing. The real value of this daily grind is slightly mysterious, almost magical. When I do it regularly, I simply feel more alive. I feel more attuned to my surroundings, a little more awake to the nuances of the day. That subtle shift in awareness makes the entire struggle worth it. But beyond the existential benefits, the practical point is to grow as a writer, to produce real, substantive prose, and to let these journal entries serve as a foundation for larger creative goals. Because human thought rarely runs in a straight line, I typically prefer to use a specific prompt to anchor these life notes rather than just typing willy-nilly. My favorite method involves a bit of translation. I listen to my own voice recordings, captured while walking and thinking aloud, and use the keyboard to type out a direct response. This kinetic bridge between walking, speaking, and typing transforms the raw audio into a much more focused, original kind of thinking. It grounds the stream of consciousness in a physical moment. When I look at the scope of these entries, I realize I am using them to talk about absolutely everything. Besides just documenting the choreography of my daily life, my personal experiences, or the practical logistics of my world, I find myself diving headfirst into philosophy, essay outlines, and a revolving door of digital media and video ideas. The act of creating this massive, buzzing paragraph itself, stuffed to the brim with both deeply serious and the utterly ridiculous, can be slightly nauseating. Looking at it all at once, I see a jumble of competing considerations I actually am. Where is the coherency? What, exactly, am I trying to do here? Perhaps the body itself contains comprehension. I return to my starting point. I write to discover what I think. The raw page is a landscape of beautiful, chaotic noise. It is only through the torturous, patient effort of reworking, refining, and editing that the writing finally sheds its skin, becoming truly coherent, purposeful, and entertaining. So that's the end of my first part of my journal entry. I do have a second part I wrote for today that's a little bit more lyrical, but that one was a lot more practical. And I'd said a few things about the years by which the years that I've practiced this craft, but it actually goes back much further. I grew up without writing much or thinking about writing or reading much. I later discovered it as something that was transformative. And so I found myself with a deep longing to be a writer at the age of 22. But I also found my mind to be completely blank. I had all the desire in the world, but I hated to admit it, but I had ultimately nothing to say. And not only that, but I had no way of figuring out a practice that would work for where I was at and what I was doing. I did not stay in school very long. I ultimately took a different path, and I ultimately found myself pursuing a very risky endeavor, which is that of self-education. I attempted to teach myself how to write, and ultimately fell in love with reading itself along the same path. And I think that what I ultimately benefited from was befriending a person who is very close to me. He was sort of my writing mentor, and through meeting with him and allowing him to see my writing and getting really, really fierce feedback, really harsh feedback, I've sort of really crystallize, you might say, my self-education, so to speak, as much as one can. I mean, of course, I could go to school, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is continue to do what I'm doing. I still have a lot to learn as a writer, but I see these journal entries as being the very stage with which I can practice this writing, because of how open-ended it is. But at the same time, what I find is that I have a huge number of essays that are like 10% to 50% written, that come out of this practice that I've been doing for 10 years, because it was 20 years ago that I began, but 10 years ago or so, maybe 12 years ago, that I began using my phone regularly to record my thoughts on a daily basis. I've been a podcast listener since the very beginning, since 2005. I was one of the first listeners. And so I've long wanted to be a part of this larger community. And so, like I said, I had almost nothing to say early on, but I think what's interesting about life is that you sort of find yourself at a point where it's not as if you have something to say, because it's not true that as people get older, they really have something to say simply by getting older. But you may come to find that there's some kind of other value to be found than the self-serving pursuit of being confirmed and thinking that you have value. And so what I mean by that is that my writing is first and foremost. And so I'm using this very technology as a way ultimately of getting feedback on my writing so that I can continue to grow and develop a voice through my words, which isn't exactly the same thing as the voice that you hear right here, right now, but it is closely related. And so I find that even in hearing my own voice, as I said earlier, in walking and hearing my own voice, that even right now, that there's something that is self-empowering. I hate to use that word empowering, but self-animating about allowing yourself to hear yourself. It sort of requires, as a preliminary, the capacity to be silent, to be alone. Because I think the greatest gift of being alone and enjoying being alone is that you can hear yourself. And it's in that moment that you deepen your interiority, you might say. This is very like figurative ways of speaking about it. It's very poetical. But what I'm meaning to suggest is that this very act of self-examination that is so fundamental to the philosophical life and has long been defended by religious traditions as introspection, as self-examination in its own path, it is rarely practiced in the way that it demands, which is a kind of attention to the self that can't simply be a dumb attention. It has to be a practiced attention, something you learn or you teach yourself over time. But ironically, it's not a set of practices because it's this act of listening. almost like reading is the opposite of a practice, because what I mean by that is that it involves a particular kind of absence. Like the best kind of reading, if you're reading a book, isn't one that brings a set of precepts or ideas to the text and projects it onto it, but can open itself up to the fullness of that text, and I believe ultimately to the full otherness of other people. And so in many ways, reading as a practice is a way of learning how to listen, how to pay attention. And so I see this practice that I'm participating in as forever self-giving. Like it's always giving back more than I'm getting from it. Or I guess it's hard to explain, but perhaps I am learning how to explain precisely what is so crucial to who I am. And of course, I think that you are truly blessed if you have a family close to you, or a spouse, or a community who can truly pay attention to you. It's the greatest gift that you can give to any person, is to listen to them as a person. You'll find that, like, once you hear this or once you sense it, you start seeing it everywhere. But most people, when they talk to other people, they're never talking to the particular person that they're talking to. They're always talking to a generalized version, a super generalized version of that specific person. I mean, I do this probably more than anybody, so I'm very guilty of this, and it has to do with getting so excited about what you're thinking, but you're not actually, in fact, responding to the very singularity of the person or the situation that you're within. And so this practice, in a certain level, is a way of grounding that and ensuring, or not ensuring, but cultivating it so that it can be done better over time. Because what I hope ultimately to do is to explore experience itself, right? I see basic human experience as being the very place with which all of what is interesting goes on. Like all that is really most meaningful goes on in the immediacy of your world and my world. And yet this is not a promotion of, or support, or an affirmation of like what they call subjectivism, or this idea that only the personal counts, or that your experience is what is most important, and nobody can understand what you've gone through, or that it's nothing like that. And it's nothing that has to do with the idea that everything is relative, that there's no such thing as objectivity because everyone has their own experience. I don't really believe any of that. I have a radically different kind of approach. But what I'm speaking about here is that we rarely consider the depth that the very surface of our lives offers us. It's right in front of us. And this isn't a mystical practice. This isn't even a poetical practice. This is a way of attenuating yourself to what is going on immediately in front of you. And it's not an intellectual thing. I just happen to be a closeted intellectual, as I say. I'm always already thinking theoretically. It's just what I do. I was born philosophical, but I don't really bring that into life per se, and I don't really even see it as primary. I see life itself in its very tactility, its tactile qualities, as being most meaningful. But you're often, when you're promoting this kind of idea, you find that there's very different versions of it that really are missing the point, or they're really betraying the opportunities that are here in the immediacy of experience. And if you're philosophical and you really believe in what used to be called the re-enchantment of reality, that, reality is beautiful and meaningful, as I do believe it is, you would find that what you're up against are what are sometimes reductively called scientific people, but in philosophy we use the word scientistic, which isn't a way of talking about scientific people unless they're being super reductive with how they think reality is, or what's going on. And the best way to understand that is to think of the kind of person who, when asked what a chair is, or what a Pepsi bottle or a Coca-Cola bottle is, God bless me, don't want to be sanctimonious. You got to be be clear about who the real saints are, and that's Coca-Cola, not Pepsi. But if you look at a Coca-Cola bottle or a chair, you might find that someone who is reductive or scientific would explain a chair purely in terms of its chemical and molecular makeup. That is, they would explain everything in terms of its supposed physical and chemical structures. And of course, I'm not supporting any kind of mysticism or anti-scientific thinking, but what I'm wanting to protect in my writing and in my thinking philosophically, what I want to preserve and hold on to is the fullness of not only objects like the Coca-Cola bottle or the table. And I know that sounds stupid, like the way that I'm saying that. So I have to explain myself more fully, because what I'm attempting to do is something that I think is really meaningful philosophically, which is to not be unobjective, right? One is not saying that one doesn't believe that things aren't real or that objective reality isn't real. But what one is wanting to hold on to is the ways in which things have a reality that supersedes their reductive caricature as they're portrayed in what is ultimately a way of, as it said, undermining reality itself. And so I'm attempting to articulate many thoughts at once, and this is ultimately an attempt to articulate what I'm even trying to do in my journal writing, which is to honor the realness of people and of things and of myself and of ideas without reducing them to their supposed properties, but also without giving into the exaggerated and the unbelievable. But one is attempting to hold on to what can be considered the subtle and the poetical. But it is, in fact, the very source of meaning in any person's particular life, because it's not when I'm doing it, right? It's just that the intent as a writer is that the reader would be inspired to attenuate themselves to their own specific reality of people in their lives. And that's something that I return to again and again, because I'm sort of very philosophically influenced by traditions associated with Anton Chekhov, the Russian short story writer, as well as Flannery O'Connor, the American Gothic short story writer, Southern short story writer, Flannery O'Connor, because what they have in common is this sort of reverence for the actuality of people. Like, when we pay attention to people, they're never what we think they are. We're always like reducing them to things without paying attention to everything that is going on. Now, of course, if you know anything, you know that never ends, right? What that means is that every person, everything is inexhaustible. You can't explain any particular thing to an extent to which it can't be explained anymore or explored anymore. And what that means is that there's a horizon of possible meanings, of poetic meanings, of philosophical explorations that are sort of, from the outside, from the practical point of view, they're seen as supercilious or as absurd. And yet, when one sees what's going on at the highest level in physics and mathematics and in music, it's the same thing going on in this philosophically performative endeavor, which is that of attempting to think thoughts into their existence, that of attempting to think experimentally, to think heuristically. As the physicist Richard Feynman had said, that it's heuristic thinking that ultimately unlocks like future results that we have no way of understanding even now. It's not to say that everything that we do is important, but that we have no right to presume the outcome of our own thoughts. And so to write, in a way, is to participate in an honorable tradition that wants to basically articulate the very best of thoughts that can be had. And not for the sake of promoting oneself, but for the sake of allowing the person reading to then see that what is valuable, what is meaningful, what is beautiful, what counts, what's worthy of action, what calls for attention, isn't out there, and it's not in the future, and it's not in the past. It's in the immediacy of your own world. It's always been there. But again, this is, on the one hand, a dumb proclamation. That's why I revere the donkey, as it's sort of one of many spiritual animals that I have. But there's something sublimely beautiful about the donkey if you give them a chance. And on the one hand, there's something else like going on in this, because it's easy to assume that everyone is right. But that's not the same thing as understanding that they're really just doing the best that they can with what they have. And they're propping up what they have to prop up, whether with language or ideas or narratives or actual power. But there's the truth. So what is the truth? We live in an age where that is laughed at. And of course, I'm one of those that laughs at that, especially when it's truth with a capital T. But is it a mistake to forego the possibility of asking a question or pursuing an endeavor like the truth and living out the consequences of that pursuit, which are meaningful in themselves, whether or not one succeeds? Because it sort of makes you a more expansive, deeper kind of person. That makes it worth it. So even if you're wrong and there's no truth, precisely in believing that it's true, that it's possible, you set yourself up to be surprised. And you will be surprised either way. But the best kind of surprise is right in front of us. And this isn't a mystical, and again, this isn't even a poetical or philosophical thing, but it's a starting point for those things. Another way to think about this is that really great scientists, right? People that are making breakthroughs, like whether discovering new things or creating new technologies, or political activists who are acting for justice, who are responding to the immediate problems and catastrophes in their life and taking action. And the artists or filmmakers or poets who are creating truly original work, they all have one thing in common. They're all paying attention to reality. And we think that it's easy to pay attention. But we are so shrouded in layer upon layer upon layer of misdirection. And, and I'm one of those. In fact, I'm worse than anyone. Like, I'm what they call postmodern. Like, I am as synthetic as they come. So I'm speaking always already of myself as a critique of myself. I'm 100% American, and I'm a child of the 90s. I grew up worshiping Nike Air Jordans and grew up believing in absurd things. And the core of this absurdity is the attempt to patch together ideas and stories to create a sort of cohesive narrative that gets you through, that allows you to feel at home. But that's not the same thing as letting all that fall apart, because it will be ripped apart at one point. But letting it fall apart allows you an opportunity. It allows you grace. And that grace is in many ways what I'm working against. I'm working against so much of what I come out of, this culture, this everything that it is on the left and the right. And so I also see myself as being a part of a larger historical situation. And what I want to hold on to is, on the one hand, very artificial and stupid. It can be seen this way. But on the other hand, it's really, really deep. And what I think is most deep about it is that it means discovering something in other people outside of us who haven't gone through what we've gone through. There's nothing like what we're going through right now as human beings in this place in time. But there's something that mammals learn by watching other mammals, even if they're historical narratives and they're not exactly real. And one of those historical narratives are the ancient Greeks. Another historical narrative are the ancient Hebrews. Another tradition are the Mycenaeans, and another are the Florentines, who are my favorites. What do they all have in common? against almost everyone else, right? What did the ancient Greeks have that the Romans didn't have, or that almost no one else had? What did the Florentines of the 16th and 17th century have that almost no one else had? They had the capacity to ask questions as large as the situations that they faced. And what you find is that the kind of cynicism and narrowness that develops after these ages is often a result of catastrophe, and it's often a result of this particular kind of grandeur not being able to sustain itself. But what you find is a kind of fall off when people no longer believe that they can act greatly or that they can create beautiful art. They no longer do. And, I'm not exactly sure what I'm saying, because even as I speak, I'm proposing a kind of experimental thought that can easily be decimated by another person, right? I mean, I'm always already open to that. But that act that I'm suggesting is precisely the outcome of what the ancient Greeks called paideia. And paideia is what I'm referring to, which isn't merely like asking questions, but paideia is a turning. It's a turning in people that is almost inexpressible. And because I'm a kind of naturalist, because I only believe in one world, I have to be careful about what I suggest, because I'm not suggesting anything transcendental, because paideia has been co-opted by the Platonic and Christian pedagogical traditions that use the word paideia to refer to their own means and ends. But what I'm wanting to recover is the primary sense with which paideia means turning. It's sort of similar to the word verse, lyric verse, poetic lyric verse, which refers to turning, the turning of the line. That's the thing that separates prose writing from poetry writing. Prose is written in a way that the arrangement of the words is irrelevant. It's simply the content that matters. In poetry, you have line breakage. And that line turning in itself is very approximate to the kind of turning in a field that ancient farmers would do when plowing. And so there's a particular relation between this kind of turning in plowing and this kind of turning in verse, and the kind of turning that is being asked for when we're facing situations that we simply can't refer to past events or past ideas as an explanation of, whether on the left or the right. We simply can't use theory. We can't use ideas. We can't use the information that we have. We have to think in radically different ways. And then it involves the kind of opening that only great questions can open. And the possibility of truth is precisely what allows this to happen. And again, this sounds really stupid because no one really takes truth seriously. And those who speak about truth, I don't take them seriously. So what happens when you think philosophically is that you do become another kind of quack. And so I'm sort of like delightfully self-aware of the fact that I am another quack in many regards. But I also honor a certain tradition that I would like to believe would save me from that, because it's a tradition that values the very kind of common sense or horse sense that most people affirm, And so many ways I'm trying to do many things at once, even with the journal writing. But I think that the relationship between the specific act of writing and thinking and this kind of question asking, which opens up the psyche in many, many manifold ways, is quite profound. Because when you enter a philosophical world of really deep thoughts, even for half an hour a day, and then you go, or reading poetry or a novel or learning how to look at paintings, even for a short while each day, you then enter the world like slightly more attuned, slightly more aware. Now, of course, I know many people that deny this. They don't experience this. They're never changed by art, or at least they don't admit it. Because I discover that I am deeply affected by the thoughts that I have, especially when I'm being serious about them. And writing is a very serious way of thinking. And I think that when we live in a culture that doesn't honor thinking at all. It doesn't really honor art. One has to really fight to get that back. And the best way to fight to get that back, to get back art as meaning something more than art, more than just going to the movies on the weekends or more than just TV commercials, but art is something meaningful. Or if one wants to recover the very political, the very idea of acting ethically, or if one wants to recover objectivity itself, thinking clearly, thinking logically, again and again, you have to begin with the immediacy of everyday life, the felt experience of your world. And that's what the journal entry is to me. And in many ways, I hope that's what draw water can be. But even life notes itself is a practice that has nothing almost to do with philosophy or poetry. It has everything to do with the very practice of thinking aloud and recording my thoughts and organizing my thoughts as a way of taking control of my life. Because I have a very, very wild mind. It's almost like in my genetics, but I have a very, very exaggerated imagination, and so I've had to sort of learn how to really like discipline it over time. And again, I don't know what anyone else's experience is like we have to be careful with that, but I know that this practice works for me, and it saves me from a lot of other tendencies and practices that would work against me. But it also creates a really solid foundation for doing what is more important than me, which is the writing itself. Because I go back to that again and again, and that is what I care about here, because it's in the act of writing that one wants to create something that is outside of oneself that can continually give back, right? And that's why I believe in poetry, and I really believe in taking your time and writing slowly and working your ass off and suffering to write really well. And I think that is fundamental to what I am and what I do. But it's almost like a sacred act. And I've gone through a kind of boot camp over the course of the winter with my mentor. And so this journal entry is sort of like the crystallization of that process. And yet I have so many more. I almost randomly selected that journal entry, but I have so much more. So I'm sort of using this as a template for the way that I'm going to record these videos. I'll record a journal entry, but maybe I'll record some thoughts afterwards like I am now. And I don't mean to editorialize. I would like to place the focus on my writing. But I would like to also just talk because I enjoy the sound of my own voice. And by the way, I now also have a Substack. So if you go to John Edward Willie, Substack, something like that, you'll find me. And you'll find 3 different draw water journal entries that I've done. And I hope to record the other 2 tonight. So I love you all, and I would take you home if I could. I'm John Edward Willie, and I hope you have a good night.